Welcome back, everybody. This is lecture 41. This will focus primarily on earthworks and postmodern architecture. So the names to look out for are, for earth art, Robert Smithson, Christo, and Jean-Claude. And then for our postmodern architecture, we'll look at a rather late example from Frank Lloyd Wright's career, which could arguably be called modernist, but a fully postmodern example in the work of Frank Gehry, his Guggenheim Museum in Spain. So Robert Smithson is probably the most significant name to look at when we talk about the subject of earthworks. So earthworks is generally a term that we use for sculpture. It's almost always very large scale, most often created and meant to be seen out of doors in a specific location, as opposed to something that's made to be put into a gallery situation. So Robert Smithson is one of the leaders of this movement in its early days, and he's best known for the piece you see on the far right, known as Spiral Jetty. The piece would have been constructed using a fair amount of heavy machinery because it is a permanent installation into the Great Salt Lake in Utah. It is essentially a jetty made primarily of stone that goes out in a spiral form into the lake. And if you see the image in the bottom right of your screen, you can see how the jetty actually acts as a break in the water line. The ripples going across the lake kind of stopping as that area inside the spiral becomes really fairly calm. So Smithson was a kind of visionary earthworks artist in the early days of the movement, and one of the things he wanted to do was to make work that couldn't really be purchased or owned by an individual, couldn't be removed from the world and put into a bank vault somewhere to just continue to increase in value and be used as an object for commodity, as an object for sales. The spiral jetty has stood the test of time. It is still there. For a time, the water in the Great Salt Lake actually submerged the artwork, and that has changed now. So you technically could go there and actually walk out onto it yourself. There are plenty of other artists working in this type of methodology, the idea of making sculpture that interacts with the earth or becomes kind of a permanent aspect of it is very much what it was in its earliest days. And on this screen you have a couple of examples. Nancy Holt's sun tunnels, which align with different solar and celestial bodies over the course of any given year. So you make the sculpture into an almost celestial calendar, if you will. The piece at the bottom is a pretty awesome one that is known as Light Fields. And no, the artwork is not the photograph. It is the installation of these lightning rods, which do, of course, attract lightning. There is a cabin on the site that you can rent, and you can actually spend time there, so you can sort of interact with nature by witnessing the kind of amazing power of the lightning being attracted to these lightning rods. Christo and Jean-Claude, a married couple of artists working together on incredibly large projects, most of which involve fabric, and this represents a shift in what earthworks really is in the contemporary scene. In the 70s, the early 80s even, earthworks very often were permanent installations. They required a fair amount of change to the landscape, and they could be in some ways as permanently changing or altering the landscape. The more contemporary view of earthworks is to make things that are temporary, that don't harm the earth, that exist for a short time, make their statement, and then are removed. And so Christo and Jean-Claude have become really famous for using fabric our attention to a variety of different ideas. They've wrapped entire buildings, they've wrapped bridges completely in fabric. My two favorite of their this screen on the left, the pink fabric that surrounds the islands is known as Surrounded Islands in Biscayne Bay, Florida. And this one I really like because it does seem almost as if someone has taken a giant pink highlighter and circled these naturally formed islands that are so close to this incredibly overbuilt American contemporary city. It does draw your attention to nature. the piece is there for a brief time and then removed. One of the things that often gets in people's attitudes about type of work is that it seems very expensive and time consuming, and so the assumption is that the American public is somehow paying for it. And in fact, Christo and Jean projects are funded entirely with their own money. They raise money through the sales of drawings, photographs, books about the work, all kinds of ephemera that's used or created in making the pieces, and then the money that is generated from those funds the next project. The piece slightly closer to your own lifetime experience in a way. What you're seeing there was called the Gates. They were in New York City's Central Park. It was installed after 9/11, and in fact, they really did draw people back to the park and got people gathering in this public space again. There have even been studies in which people who make their money from sales in the park, people who run stands, vendors who sell hot dogs and drinks in the park, for instance, or people who make their money giving carriage rides, they were really hurting as tourism fell off after 9/11. And so this project actually increased revenue. It did actually bring people to a public place. With this project in particular, they that was used in the project into the kind of netting that we use to help retain and prevent the erosion of sand dunes on beaches. So the work itself lives on in other ways. It's kind of a fascinating project. By far, I think the most successful or most interesting earthwork artist working today is Andy Goldsworthy. Goldsworthy definitely is among those artists who does not make things that harm the earth or that are permanent structures. Most of the time he creates his work by walking into nature, collecting objects that he finds, or rearranging them in some intriguing way, and then recording the work with a camera, with photography, and then they're allowed to be destroyed over time. So most of his work is very impermanent, which is a kind of daring thing to do. When you think about the so far this semester, everything that we've looked at really has been made to last for a really, really long time. But of course, human beings are temporary creatures. Life changes, nature changes, and that's part of what Goldsworthy's work, I think, is really all about. The documentary Rivers and Tides is a really good resource if you want to learn more about his work and hear it directly from him. It's got some pretty fascinating aspects. These are some of my personal favorites of his, the works made with snow and with ice. The icicle in the bottom center of your screen is a great example of a temporary earthwork made from a material that will very quickly melt and disappear. He took a single icicle, broke it, and then froze the pieces back together again and turned them into different orientation, obviously, to create this kind of Fibonacci sequence spiral. Also does what he calls drawings. You see those in the top middle and top right of the screen. He'll lie down on the ground as it begins to rain or begins to snow and allow the ground around him to be saturated, and then he'll carefully stand up and jump out of his own silhouette, and it sort of leaves this temporary impression of his body in this vast field. Kind of an intriguing way of using nature to make an image that's temporary. So we want to also look section not only at sculpture being made in an unusual way, but how about architecture made in an unusual way? So just to kind of recap, we're going to look a little more at modernism in architecture. This would be the style of architecture that really becomes popular in the United States as architects and designers are fleeing Europe, bringing these kind of new ideas like the Stil and of course Bauhaus to the United States. So we talked about the Bauhaus idea of art everyone, and that architecture was a unification of all the arts and unifying it with your daily life. One of the directors, of course, of the Bauhaus was Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, and van der Rohe became very successful instructor of architecture, teacher of architecture, and the leader of architectural groups in this country when he fled the Nazis and came to the US. So the image on the left is the original Bauhaus building. What you see on the right is an international style, what we kind of call the style of architecture that was influenced by these architects from Europe to America. It's Van der Rohe's design with Philip Johnson, the Seagram building in New York City. And of course, Van der Rohe's design philosophy was less is more, this idea of simplicity and these clean lines showing the industrial materials and really showing that the thing is very, very clear. Certainly, this style of architecture is very recognizable to us. These look like what we normally think of as skyscrapers. In this shot of this piece, the building is known as Lever House. It's the headquarters of the Lever soap company. It is across the street from the building we just looked at, and it also has those exposed girders at the bottom so that the building kind of seems to float, which opens space. But what you're seeing here is essentially a courtyard that's open to the sky. That's this section of the building that wraps the whole of the city block that it occupies, but rather than having a flat roof across, it's actually open to the sky. I think of a square donut. So it creates air, light, and movement on the ground in a way that other skyscrapers really would not be able to achieve. You can get a sense there of how similar it is in some respects to the architecture design that you saw by Van der Rohe. And so the international style may, to some people's taste, lack a certain degree of personality. But remember, these were architects who were trying to create something that was functional, utilitarian, that was universal, and also that would allow for simplicity, that didn't have to have all kinds of architectural elements attached onto it, like gargoyles or columns and statuary. So it's a very modern approach to architecture. Perhaps the most modern of these buildings, of course, no longer exists. These, are, of course, were the towers, the World Trade Center. And I thought it was kind of interesting to look at the words of the architect who initially designed the buildings. And this was said way before 9/11, mind you. World trade means world peace. The World Trade Center is a living symbol of man's dedication to world peace. The World Trade Center should become a representation of man's belief in humanity. So it's kind of interesting to me that these sort of cold, simple boxes without a lot of excessive decoration were meant by the people who designed them to be the ultimate democratic structures. They were meant to be for anybody, that you didn't have to understand European history, that you didn't have to temples and the history of architecture to get it, and that they could function in the most simple and direct and unpretentious way. Those really are kind of universal, everyone is equal ideas that are very much at the heart of what the experiment democracy in America is all about. Of course, made them a perfect target for the terrorists. So when you think about what they were doing in disrupting our financial system is one thing, but also attacking in a way the very ideals that the culture itself is meant to represent. Another very individualistic approach to what we call modernist style is the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, probably the single most famous American architect, bar none. And Frank Lloyd Wright really believed things specific to the sites that they were going to be in, as opposed to designing an idea and then just building it in any location. His architecture is meant specifically to be in the place that it is intended to go. So the style that you're seeing here of this building, which is round, very long, very, very horizontal, is called Prairie Style, which references the flat grasslands in the Midwest, which is find the majority of these examples. Frank Lloyd Wright is known for cantilevering. That's the idea here of how the elements extend out without having to have support beams on their corners underneath. So things like awnings and porches and so forth can jut out at 90 angles from the main building out into space. One of the things I love about his designs is that he really believed in following this design idea that the heart here would be the heart of the home. And so in this area you have the living center, living room. On the other side of this wall, which is essentially an open plan, you can walk around this way or around this way, you would enter the dining area. So the main living space, the main functional area together, sitting and enjoying each other's company, the two big living spaces become kind of one large open area with the fireplace in between. That the bricks he's used for this building are not your standard size bricks that you could get at Lowe's or Home Depot. They're much shorter and much, much wider. And in fact, those bricks were specifically made for this building. And if you look closer, you can even see that the grout in between them, the mortar that joins between the horizontal levels, but reddish in between the vertical joints, so that at a distance, they kind of blend into the same color all the way across, just again emphasizing that horizontal stretch of the building. Pretty remarkable. This is perhaps a famous private home. This is the Kaufman House, nicknamed Falling Water. It's near Bear Run Creek in Pennsylvania, and it was literally built on site, and it imitates the kind of natural terrain landscape that was left as glaciers moved rocks to form of this area and deposited rocks in strata. You can kind of see the natural stone, which is all from the general area, built up one on top of the other, so that the building becomes almost terraced the way the landscape itself is. But my favorite aspect of this building is right here. This area right is in fact the hillside coming straight up through the house. The flooring is laid around this level of the rock that, so it's sitting on this natural seating area in front of the fireplace. You're literally sitting on raw nature the way it was when that building was actually planned. The Frank Lloyd Wright piece to know for the test is this one. It's the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York City. And I would argue that this piece in 1959 kind of transitions us from modern architecture into this newfangled idea of postmodern architecture. The building challenging. It doesn't have 90-degree corners. It doesn't have rectangles or squares like the other designs of his that we saw. It's a spiral. And on top of that, it actually seems to almost be upside down. The topmost layer of the building on the outside is much, much larger than the smallest toward the main center of the building. So it defies a lot of logical ideas, and it begins to operate in a way challenges what architecture has always been and questions what it might be as we go into the new era. So this really is our transition to postmodernism. So again, trying to understand this term, it is frustrating because post simply means after. The issue here is that we've been calling an architecture modern really since, you could argue, the 1850s, since the realist movement with Gustave Courbet. Certainly would include Impressionism as the first truly modern art style, so now 1860s, but certainly by the time we have the post-impress movement with Van Gogh and Gauguin in the 1880s, it's really hard to say that that isn't modern art or the very beginnings of it. So what do we do now? Years past that point, we can't keep calling everything modern. So really, we should be calling the art of today contemporary art. A good way to signify the difference would be to refer to the work, say, from the 1850s to the 1960s as modern art, and every 60s, we can call that postmodern. Now, frustratingly, there's no single set of rules that describes what postmodern art is, but in general, some things can be used to help sort of clarify what makes something postmodern other than just the time period in which it was made. It really is about trying to break rules, almost as if breaking the rules is the only rule. We also see a rejection of the ideas that have come before, that history painting is the only good kind of painting, for instance, or that art is only for specific type of audience, specifically a luxury item for wealthy clients. It also tends to ask questions more than So a lot of postmodern art can be kind of provocative, somewhat in your face, somewhat challenging, but without necessarily telling you how to think about it. On top of that, we also see an increase in artists really mixing and melding things together that haven't been used before. Taking an image that exists in another form and reusing it, recontextualizing it, changing its meaning is something that we've certainly painting, but we can now begin to see that even in architecture. Take a look here. This is the new-ish entrance to the Louvre Museum. The original building is Baroque French architecture. It doesn't go with this element at all. And that's very much what postmodern architecture can do. It can really challenge your perception of what is quality, what is high art versus low art, your sensibility of what you expect to see, and provide you with a really unique experience. Certainly postmodern architecture, you see elements of it all around you. Even the classroom building at Cape Fear, the Wilson Center, has an awning that looks a lot like this, which is also open to the sky, so it doesn't function the way it appears that it should. That's a rather modern approach. Buildings are now being decorated on the outer cladding with an enormous variety of different materials. This brickwork goes right up to this concrete. There's no logical reason other than decorative quality for there to be this angle where the two surfaces change from one material. That the architecture is beginning to become sculptural and painterly as well. The same architect who was the designer of the previous slide also gave us this example, which I thought you guys would enjoy. It's Michael Graves' design for a building for the Disney Corporation, and it's hilarious. It's got columns holding up a pediment, very much like a Greek temple, and those columns obviously are carved to look like the characters of the Seven Dwarfs. Art history, if you studied Art History Survey 1, you know that Greeks and the Egyptians as well created columns carved to look like male or female characters to support sections of buildings. This happens to be the Porch of the Maidens from the Eric Theon in. This is a great example of a postmodern building. This almost looks like a spaceship has crashed onto a traditional building. So architects who work in this postmodern way very often use unexpected materials, unexpected angles. What you're seeing here was a design that was made because the company that owned this building needed a conference room. There wasn't a big enough room in the building to do that, and instead of renovating a space, they built this new room on the top level of the building, surrounded by this bizarre spine of glass. Frank Gehry is the best example for us of a postmodern architect. This is Gehry's Guggenheim Museum in Spain, and it is a bizarre building, especially when you see it here. This is one of my favorite street toward the building itself. Really reveals how different it is from what you expect architecture to do. There's not a 90-degree in that building. It is made of highly polished metal. It has curves in every possible dimension. There's almost no area inside or out that conforms to what you think a building should do. This is the main lobby on the interior. You can see that it has an enormous number of curved surfaces. This is a Frank Gehry design that's relatively speaking recently completed in 2003. It happens to be a performing arts center that's named in honor of Walt Disney, but I thought it would be a good place for you to really see the difference architecture and the international modernist style. You'll never confuse one for the other.